Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this 9th webinar in a series of webinars held by the Emirates Policy Center in Abu Dhabi to foresee the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis on the world and the region. This webinar will deal with the future of the conflict in Syria in light of the Cesar Act and implications of the coronavirus crisis. Although 9 years have passed since the outbreak of the war in Syria, prospects of ending this conflict and reaching a political settlement are still uncertain. On the ground, the northern eastern parts of Syria are still out of control of the regime in Damascus. These parts are controlled either by Syrian opposition factions and Turkey in northern Syria, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, east of the Euphrates. President Bashar al-Assad has even failed to regain the state's government control. He has also failed to enforce security, stability, and restore social fabric, as well as restoring normal life and improving living and economic conditions of people. At the political level, the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 2015, setting out the outlines of a nationwide ceasefire and reaching a lasting political settlement in Syria based on a new constitution and free and fair elections, has not been implemented. Furthermore, the Syrian Constitutional Committee, which include the regime, the opposition, and civil society, and held its first round in October 2019, has reached a deadlock after the second round. In a recent statement, Special Envoy of UN Secretary General for Syria said that it is expected that the third round might be held next August. Today, Syria is suffering from a de facto division. The continuous presence of various foreign forces, the widespread devastation of the state structure, institution and infrastructure, and the huge degradation in living and economic conditions and services. The spread of COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the situation either in Syrian cities and towns or in Syrian refugees camps. In mid of June 2020, the US started the application of the Cesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, also known as the Cesar Act, which was seen by many observers and analysts as the game changer in the Syrian conflict. From their perspective, this legislation will deprive the Syrian president of the opportunity to turn the military victory he has achieved on the ground into a political capital that consolidates his grip on power for good and deny the Syrian regime's allies, Russia and Iran, the fruits of their military intervention in the country in support of al-Assad. We hold this webinar today to discuss the development and prospect of the Syrian crisis, in which we host a select of experts and specialists in the Syrian affairs. Those include Dr. Hussein Abish, who is a senior resident, a scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and well known of being active in advocacy for Arab causes in the United States. And also we have Dr. Basma Qudumani, who is a scholar and university professor in France. She is currently a member of negotiation team for the UN led peace talk in Syria and a member of Syrian Constitutional Committee and a well-known Arab woman. And of course, Mr. Zaki Mahshi, who is an economist and a senior consulting fellow in Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House and a researcher at London School of Economics. I would like to welcome our speaker for today and thank them for accepting our invitation to participate in this event. I would also like to welcome the audience who attend this webinar, which is live streamed on EPC's account on various social media platforms and the center's YouTube channel via Zoom application. Before I give the floor to the speakers, I would like to draw the attention of our Arab viewers that they can listen to the Arabic interpretation of the discussion by clicking on the French channel down on the screen for the language. الأخوة العرب المتابعون لنا بإمكانهم الاستماع إلى ترجمة باللغة العربية بالضغط على الزر الخاص باللغة في أسفل الشاشة واختيار اللغة الفرنسية لسماع الترجمة بالعربية. At first, I would like to ask every speaker to give us an initial intervention for 3 minutes on the topic of our today discussion. I wish to start with Dr. Hussein Ebish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibtisam, and I wanted to say thank you so much to you and to the EPC always for inviting us and for setting up these very excellent programs. All right, so the coronavirus and the Cesar Act come together in a very interesting way in Syria as they are the two newest pressures on a social and economic situation on top of the lingering war in various parts of the country, especially in the north and northeast, that are putting additional new pressures on the structure of the society and the ability of the government to function. And what's remarkable is that while the regime and with its backers from Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and others, effectively won the main part of the war that began in 2011 when the rebel-held parts of Aleppo fell to them, and they seemed in a way maybe to be moving into a phase of consolidating their victory and economic and infrastructure reconstruction and rebuilding Syria under their control. Actually, what has happened is that all of the underlying social and economic factors that led to the uprising in the first place in 2011 and that developed into the civil war and that have undermined the stability of the regime are worse than ever. And that the regime actually's authority, even among parts of its support base, is being eroded. So you've already got a situation where reconstruction has been very halting and hasn't gone forward, and there's no real international structure for it, right? And the Cesar Act is an effort to make that conditional and to try to prevent entities and individuals associated with the regime and even their foreign supporters from benefiting from the reconstruction. So it's very much aimed at sending the message like, you will not profit from this money that is going to circulate. That goes on top of the collapse of the currency in Syria, right? And the fact that now the government forces people to exchange through the government at 75% below market value. So it's extracting value every time a remittance comes. Every time a Syrian somewhere else sends money to Syria, now they cannot use the Hawala offices. They have to go through the government, and the government takes 3/4 of the value of it. In addition to which, the whole Lebanese collapse, the collapse of the Lebanese lira as well, and the fact that it's becoming much more difficult for the Syrian government to use the Lebanese economy as an outlet is again creating more and more pressure. And I think it's very interesting that the way in which currency supply and currency exchange is being used politically in both Lebanon and Syria, and collapsing is kind of a parallel to Venezuela in many ways, and the economic collapse in Venezuela. So what you've got then is a lot more pressure, not only among those parts of the country that were unsympathetic to the regime, but even where there was sympathy among Alawite citizens, especially the split with Rami Makhlouf is very bad sign for the regime. The closure of Al-Bustan Foundation, which was supporting a lot of the base of the regime, has not been, augmented by the government, and you've got, I think, a lot of spreading of discontent, and the uprising among the Druze in Soweida is another very, very bad sign. So here's the question. On the battlefield, I'm sure all the forces, opposition, regime, inside, outside, are going to say, well, we're going to continue no matter the virus, and the sanctions don't matter. So we're just going to continue with our mission. The question is, what would the impact of all this additional pressure be? Would it be just more suffering, or would it change the political equation? And that we don't know, but there are major new interventions.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. We are going also to cover this through Q&A. Dr. Basma, please. Dr. Basma Qudumani.
Thank you, Dr. Ibtisam, and thank you for this invitation at a moment for Syria, which is a very critical moment. I think the international community has now been used to the news from Syria as being depressing, despairing, and there is a lot of indifference to a situation, and really the complexity of it leaves a majority of people wondering when and how this can end. But the reality is we are at a very important moment of this conflict. We have had 9 years, almost 9 years of a military confrontation. And I say military confrontation, although the opposition remained up to the first year almost resisting the militarization of the conflict, but eventually it took over. Why did it take over? I think the Assad government did not know how to deal with political demands. It did not want to address any political demands. So its best bet was to take this conflict or to take this challenge from its population to the military field, a military ground, and have this big military confrontation. It won. Can we say Assad won? I would say Assad was losing. And in a military confrontation, he was actually losing in 2013, 14, and then 15 until Russia came in and threw its weight behind the regime. So we know that this military victory is really not Assad's military victory. So he failed politically in the first place to handle this challenge, the crisis. He also failed militarily to bring the country under his control alone. Now that tells us that the responsibility for restoring law, order, normality to Syria is really more in the hands and the responsibility of those who have rescued Assad. I think we all know that Assad has very little to offer, nothing much to offer. I think, and we've had many indications, that he has become more of a liability than an asset for his allies. Why? Because he doesn't even cooperate when they ask him for minimal concessions in order to just convince the world and market him again and convince the world that there is a path to gradual change in Syria. He has prevented this gradual change from ever happening. We witnessed this in Geneva, when we go to Geneva. There is total rejection of any attempt from our side and from the international community side, from the UN side, to cooperate even in a discussion. Entering into a negotiation seems to be, by in itself, a challenge that the Assad government is unwilling to confront. So we are really in a situation today, diplomatically, where we need to work more with the international community in order to prepare a safe future for Syria. That future could have been gradual. Unfortunately, Assad is preventing it from being gradual. Are we going towards a scenario where there is sudden collapse? All of us in Syria fear sudden collapse and chaos, and we are trying to avoid that. Unfortunately, there's no cooperation. So I am suggesting here that this regime is entirely dependent on his allies today, and that his allies, who think that they brought the population under control by force, are now witnessing what Dr. Hussein just said. Oh, but he cannot govern. But he is unable even to, things are starting again. Here are people going back on the streets and calling again peacefully for a change. So what happened? Is this a decade? Have we gone full circle in this military rationale and now find ourselves at the starting point of this is a dictatorship that has added to its authoritarian practices 10 years of crimes, really, against its own population. So what do we do with this regime? People today are starving in Syria. We are on the brink of starvation. Some areas more than others. There is agriculture in Syria. Syrians rely on their agriculture. I hope this can continue to prevent starvation, famine. Aid may not go into Syria to more than 4 million people living in the northwest, just because yesterday Russia opposed its veto to a resolution that would have allowed humanitarian aid to go through the northwest, through the Turkish border. Where does that leave us? The population has been taken hostage throughout these years, and today that is the risk again. So if we talk about Cesar Act, I would say, yes, the Cesar Act is a challenge for all Syrians. Yet the Cesar Act is our sole barrier today to allowing Assad to feel that he can go back to as if nothing had happened and go back to normal, reconstruct, as one would call it, what he has destroyed, not himself, but the international community. So the cost of the Cesar Act is yet to be measured, but at this stage, the signal is, no, you will not have it this way. And I believe that is the signal that says, now we need a serious political process. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Basma. Mr. Zaki, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sam, and thanks to EPC for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Actually, in brief, I believe we can discuss the Cesar Act from two different but interlinked perspectives. The first one is political perspective. The second one is economic perspective. Now, from political perspective, it seems that the US administration is using the act as a foreign political tool to increase its political bargaining power in Syria. Not only with the regime's allies, I mean Russia, mainly Russia, and to less extent Iran, but also with other countries, including EU countries and Gulf countries. And I'm talking here about general political bargaining power. So in brief, the act is being used by United States as a tool to impose its condition on any future solution for Syria. And by the way, these conditions may not be in line with the UN resolution, mainly the resolution number 2254. Also within the within the political perspective, the act or the impact of the act could have or could lead to more polarization between the different external actors involved in Syria. And here I'm talking about the United States from one side and Russia and Iran from the other side, because Russia and Iran will not accept to limit their influences in Syria based on the conditions of Cesar Act, after all what they did for the regime in Syria. A third point within the political perspective is the fact it's more internal politics. It's the fact that the act deepens somehow the de facto division in Syria, because it exempts, for example, the self-administration controlled areas from the sanctions. So it's dealing with Syria as de facto divided country, and it deepens, or it may lead to more division within within the country. Now, from an economic perspective, of course, the act has already chilling effect on many foreign companies and international organizations, because these entities prefer not to deal with the Syrian regime anymore, even with transactions related to humanitarian aid, for example. But they prefer to avoid risk and not to deal at all with the Syrian regime. And this, of course, will affect directly the economy inside the country and will increase the cost of transactions, financial transactions, the cost of production, the cost of trade, import and export, and the cost of all goods and services coming and produced in Syria. Also, from an economic perspective, it's important to highlight the point that Cesar Act is not, or let's say it's only an additional factor that contribute to the deterioration of Syrian economy, because there are many other factors, including the continuous armed conflict, corruption, cronyism, high dependency on external actors. And we always should remember that the estimation showed that even before the implementation of Cesar Act, I mean by the end of 2019, the economic loss for Syria is estimated at almost $500 billion, which equals to about 9 times Syria's GDP in 2010. And this is a huge amount of money. The last 2 points that I want to mention in terms of the economic impact of the Cesar Act, the first point is that this act may push the regime to depend more on illegal economic networks at national and international levels, because the regime is currently actually depends a lot on warlords and criminal networks to sustain its control over the country and to sustain its control over the economic foundation of the country. But now with Cesar Act, most probably these networks will be more empowered and the regime will depend more and more on this kind of criminal networks. The last point I want to mention is that many literature shows that all authoritarian regimes, like the Syrian regime, they are able to redirect the negative impact of sanctions to hit mainly the ordinary civilians, because they have this networks of crony capitalists and warlords that are able to overcome the sanctions and to put all the burden of the sanctions on ordinary citizens. And also authoritarian regimes usually use sanctions as an excuse for their people, mainly the loyalists, to say that all economic failure that they are facing is because the sanctions. And this is what the regime's propaganda now is working on. Finally, or that's why we need to discuss or to investigate what are the channels that through which international community can continue to support Syrian people inside Syria without legitimizing Syrian regime within the difficult Syrian context. And here I'm talking about the difficult institutional, socio-economic situation, including the outbreak of coronavirus and the sanctions imposed on the regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zaki. Before we move to Q&A, I would announce again for our Arab viewers that we have Arabic interpretation. Just you can press the button of interpretation and choose French to listen to the Arabic interpretation. الأخوة العرب لدينا ترجمة باللغة العربية، فقط اضغطوا على الزر في أسفل الشاشة المكتوب عليه interpretation واختاروا اللغة الفرنسية. I will start with Basma. Dr. Basma, what are the implications of implementing the Cesar Act and the coronavirus crisis on the distribution of power among major actors in Syria?
A great question.
Dr. Basma. Dr. Basma. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ibtisam. I hope I heard your question well because I had a small...
I will repeat it again for
Thank you. Yes, because some of it...
What are the implications of implementing the Cesar Act and the coronavirus crisis on the distribution of power among major actors in Syria?
I think, first of all, I think the description that Zaki Mahshi just made is a very accurate one, and I think from what he has said, it is good to monitor now how this redistribution of power is going to take place inside the country. I think we have definitely a constraint an unprecedented constraint on the means of action and intervention for the Assad regime, for the Assad family as a whole, and that transpires in the conflicts between members of the family, which many people have been trying to read in terms of political differences. The truth is, it is about the cake. The cake has shrunk and there's very little to share. And so they're going to go after each other. How much did you get over the years? And it's thanks to me, so now you have to pay back. That is the kind of dispute that is taking place currently in the family. I would say, unfortunately, I wish we could read in it important political differences. Those are not there. This is a family as a network of people who have basically sucked up all of Syria's energy and resources and are now finding it not enough for their greed. So how that reflects on the country, I think is leaving Assad's allies very frustrated, very frustrated. He cannot pay them back, literally pay them back for his debt. They cannot really puncture, as they did, Syria's resources and hope for those juicy contracts which they've been waiting for, because the Cesar Act is signaling really it's going to last a long time. It's going to be very hard on Assad. And if you want to continue supporting, now you are going to bear the price. And I think the sanctions, the Cesar Act, to me, is not going to change Assad's attitude so much. You know, Assad will probably be the last one to understand that his time is over, that it's too late, that what he has done is just not possible anymore to be left without any consequences. But it is addressed to his allies.
Yeah.
It is specifically addressed to, of course, Iran, which is under sanctions by the United States in different ways, and also, and more specifically, Russia.
Right.
If Russia is a rational player, and I think Russia is a rational player, it's unfair, it is tough, it is everything we want to call it, ambitious, etc. But it understands the messages of, you have to now come to a constructive attitude in this country if you want to have an exit scenario that looks like a victory for yourselves. So this is the incentive for Russia. You have this hopeless partner who is not cooperating on anything. He is preventing you from going anywhere with the Syria of tomorrow. And you have the Syrian population on your hands now. What are you going to do? He cannot govern them. You cannot govern them from abroad. If you want this country to come back in some way, then you have to work with those powers who are telling you it cannot continue. So for me, it's a mutual detent vis-a-vis Russia coming from the United States. The United States have not taken any decisive action to change the course of this conflict over the years. Now it is signaling that it is at a level where it can prevent anything from happening. So cooperation is the only way out of this. And that is really what we hope for. Not a made in Moscow solution, not a made in Washington solution either, but definitely a cooperation at the international level and then at the regional level for Syria to regain some space to build itself.
Thank you, Basma. Hussein, what are the strategic objectives behind the Cesar Act? Does this reflect a shift in Washington perspective on the Syrian conflict?
You know, that is a really fascinating question. And I have to tell you, I think it depends who you ask. One of the things that has really characterized American foreign policy increasingly since the end of the Cold War, now since the 90s, and more and more and more through George W. Bush, through Obama, and now into Trump, is that there is often a lack of a clear goal in an administration or within Congress. So if you ask somebody, why are you doing this thing that you're doing, you would get different answers from different people. So I think that there are several different motivations for the Cesar Act, right? So one of them, especially coming from Congress, is exactly what Dr. Basma was saying, which is to let Assad and his backers know that they will not be the beneficiaries of the reconstruction of Syria, especially if foreign international funding is needed. They will not reap the profits personally or collectively. They will not enrich themselves, and it's not okay. In other words, the current situation is not an acceptable one, and the United States is not going to just allow it to go forward. But I think that there are then two other ideas that are there. The other one is exactly what Dr. Basma was saying about communicating with Russia. And I think the idea of communicating with Russia is to say, look, you know, we understand that you have your goals in Syria. We understand your investments. We understand your long-standing relationship with Syria. We understand your military assets in Tartus and elsewhere. We get that. And we understand that you have a role there. And in fact, we even recognize that Turkey has a role there in a way. But what we don't accept is that your role it relies on this regime that's so damaging and that you can't pressure this regime to change or reform or adapt. In other words, to make them see that two things are necessary. One is to not tie their interests completely to the Assad regime and its network of criminal activities, and the other is to tie its future in Syria too tightly to Iran and Hezbollah. Right? And that's really important, because the third message is to Iran and Hezbollah, which is to say that we are, this is part, the Cesar Act cannot be separated from the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. It is the biggest single thing, I think, for Donald Trump and O'Brien and Pompeo and the senior most people in the administration on foreign policy. This is not necessarily the way Congress sees it, but the way they see it is that this is part of a campaign to pressure Iran, to pressure Lebanon, to pressure Hezbollah, to pressure Assad, to pressure everyone on that side in the Iranian alliance, and make their life as painful and miserable as possible. So those are the three ways in which it functions.
Thank you, Hussein. Zaki, can Assad regime surpass the Cesar Act, and how? And how accurate the reports that the Cesar Act will have side effects by helping the corrupt elite that the regime uses to surpass sanctions?
Yes, thank you very much for this important question, actually, Dr. Tissam. We know that the Syrian regime is used to the US sanctions since 1979. So the regime during this last 50 years has developed mechanism to overcome sanctions. Most probably these mechanisms depend mainly on warlords, illegal networks, and smugglers. For example, smuggling routes between Syria and Lebanon, or Lebanon to Syria. So the regime has many techniques and mechanisms to overcome sanctions, but at the same time, not within this context, because the regime now is suffering from 9 years of continuous armed conflict. The economy is completely collapsed. The majority of Syrian people, more than 90% of Syrian people, are living under poverty line. And now the question is not how many people is living under poverty line, but the question is the gap, the poverty gap, because there is now an increasing gap between the national poverty line and household income. So people are, as Dr. Basma said, Syria is on the edge of starvation. Many households cannot find food to eat, or they don't have financial accessibility to have food with good quality. So the conditions are very difficult for the regime. That's why most probably the regime will increase dependency on external actors, on Russia and Iran. I can't hear you, Dr. Tissam, if you're talking.
You're still muted.
Yeah. What are the current revenues of the regime now?
Yeah. The main revenues for the regime, I mean, oil and wheat are not anymore under the regime control. The regime depends financially on external support. We know that Iran is providing the regime with a monthly of 1 million barrel of oil. And this is almost, I mean, millions of dollars. Iran is opened credit lines for the regime with, till now, with $9 billion, excluding oil support. So the regime is completely depending on external actors and on debt and credit lines opened by its allies. In addition to the tax and fees that are collected from the ordinary citizens, in addition to the confiscation happened for lands of opposition or even for many Syrians for the interest of cronies. Of course, in addition to this, there are the illegal type of revenues. And here I'm talking about revenues coming from smuggling. For example, there are smuggling routes between Lebanon and Syria, and the beneficiaries are Hezbollah and the 4th Armed Division. So there is this kind of conflict economy and conflict-related revenues that the regime depends on in Syria. But these kinds of revenues are mainly for the elite or for the inner circle. It's a kind of reallocation of wealth and resources for Syria from the majority of people to only the elite or the cronies surrounding the inner circle and surrounding the Syrian president. But with sanctions and the continuation of conflict, even these types of revenues are depleting and are decreasing. So the regime is in a very difficult situation from financial point of view. That's why most probably the dependency on external actors will increase. So the question here, to what extent Russia and Iran can continue their financial support to the regime and to sustain the regime power and authority in Syria, and mainly in Damascus, actually.
Thank you. Basma, why was the regime unable to end the war decisively despite its alliance with world and regional powers, Russia and Iran? Are there any beneficiaries from a prolonged Syrian conflict?
Beneficiaries, definitely, as in any conflict that lasts for some time, the economy of war develops, and some players have, of course, a lot of interest in the continuation of the conflict. But I don't think this is the most decisive factor. What really is the decisive factor here is for Assad. You know, in other conflict situations, you would find that the military confrontation is one phase, then comes a political.
We lost Basma.
It's too bad.
Basma, freezing her. Okay, I'll move to you, Hussein, until Basma come back.
Oh, she's back.
Okay, Basma?
Yes, I think it just disappeared. I disappeared for a few seconds. I understand that. Yes, I think here that you know, in a conflict situation, a rational behavior of even a dictator would be you settle then with your population on something by saying, I prevailed militarily, and now we need a political arrangement that is going to reflect my superiority and my hegemony, but somewhere there is a place, a space for society. The approach is not that one. It's very odd the way that since the intensive phase of the war, the high intensity war stopped, except for the Northwest, the behavior has been to continue punishing the population on every single aspect. So it's their property, the property of those who dared to challenge the regime in 2011. These are the ones punished every day. These are the ones taxed while they are completely impoverished after all these years. These are the ones who are not receiving humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is distributed in very discriminatory ways. And even the head of the Syrian Red Crescent, which is supposed to be this humanitarian body, just came under sanctions in the United States because the man is totally corrupt and part of that system. So we have nothing we have no recourse in that Syrian political system to say maybe there is somewhere where there is sanity, where there is somebody looking forward to a country which has a government and a society. It's as if this was a government on its own and its society does not count. And I'm saying this because we are seeing the regime's constituency, or those who are considered to be his constituency, who have fought for him, who have lost their children, their men, the young men of their community in the coastal area. This community has been decimated to fight for the survival of Assad. And yet they themselves are also impoverished. They themselves are not receiving any attention for payback for what they have really sacrificed for. So there's a very, very alarming, not alarming, I mean, we have lost hope, but in this regime to make sense in its attitude vis-a-vis society. But what is the solution in Assad's eyes? Have we ever heard from him what he is looking to build as a society? Who are the Syrians and how should they live under his government? There's no indication of that anymore. So this is where I say there's total loss of any plan to govern the country, and we are really, again, I would say, looking to his allies, looking to the international community to say something has to be done. This society is entirely hostage to this regime, and nothing will save it unless you deal with the regime. So don't talk to the opposition and say there is no partner for negotiations. We are a partner, but we are more of a partner for the international community because we have no partner on the other side to talk to. So we want to build the alternative to what we have today in Syria with the international community through a constitution, security plan, the judiciary, restoring law and order. All of that we can't do with Assad. We would like to do it, but we cannot do it with Assad. We have to do it with his allies.
Thank you, Basma. Hussein, how does Russia's strategic perception of its role converge in both fields of conflict in Syria and Libya? Will its intervention in Libya complicate the conflict in Syria by virtue of Moscow's conflicting interests with those of the US and Turkey on both issues?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, it certainly is a matter of, those are the two main fronts in which Russia is reasserting itself as a proactive actor in the Middle East on the ground. I mean, militarily. In Libya, yes, it's mainly through mercenaries, the Wagner group, but still, Russia is obviously a key player in Libya, and interestingly, in both cases, it's brought Russia into a certain degree of conflict and competition with the great regional rising power, which is Turkey, which is starting to assert itself also as a kind of a post-NATO, unleashed from the West, unleashed from the United States, new kind of hegemonic and ideological factor in the region. So I think in a way, Russia is trying to not only to reassert itself and promote its interests, it's also trying to offset the rise of others, and particularly the rise of Turkey. And it's, again, in both cases, a matter of splitting the difference. Russia is not going to go to war, even in northeast Syria against, northwest Syria, excuse me, against Turkey. It's not going to go to war directly against Turkey and the GNA in Libya, but it can, I think, say, okay, this is as much as you get and not more. And demanding that Turkey does a deal, both in Libya, which you can see it already starting, I think, starting to emerge, you know, where there's a sense now that how far will the GNA forces be allowed to go into the oil crescent, into the central Libya, let alone into eastern Libya, forget it. You know, there's a real sense that lines are being drawn by various parties, including Russia. And in Syria, again, you've seen Russia sort of draw lines for Turkey as well, and vice versa. So what you end up with then is the sense that there are these regional conflicts that are helping to define strategic relations and even ideological structures in the region that are being determined by actors that were not central to the Middle East 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Russia, Turkey, these were not the central actors, and yet they are emerging. So again, I think that what shows us really is the extent to which there is a vacuum of leadership in the region, the extent to which we are in, whether this will continue for a long time, but at the moment we are in a kind of post-American phase, in a sense. Not the US is irrelevant, but it just does not exercise the power it has. And finally, that Russia really is very ambitious. The only thing I would emphasize is there is a potential distinction between Russian national interests on the one hand and Putin's political interests on the other hand. For Putin, it's very important to be perceived as having backed a winner in Syria. In other words, when the United States tries to appeal to Russian interests to say, look, you know, Assad's a liability, Iran is a liability, you need to deal with us, you need to deal with Ankara, you need to deal with the Gulf countries, you need to deal with the responsible players, and, you know, whether you like them or not, and not be not be putting all your weight on irresponsible and ultimately unworkable allies like Al-Assad or even Iran and Hezbollah and just players that are fundamentally not reliable. I think from a Russian point of view, that can make sense. But from Putin's own personal political perspective, it becomes problematic because he puts so much personal effort into this. He owns that war in Syria. So I think to the extent to which there's a melding between Putin's own personal agenda and Russia's foreign policy becomes harder. To the extent to which it becomes liberated, either because Putin becomes so strong that he doesn't care, or his authority becomes somehow less, or in a certain sense, there are other forces arise. You could get there either way, but that's the last thing I wanted to say.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you. Zaki, in light of the financial and economic crisis in Lebanon, does Lebanon still represent a financial and economic lifeline for Syrian regime? We know that Lebanon holds around $40 billion worth of Syrian assets and serve as the country's main link to the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
Zaki?
Yes, thank you. Actually, if we can, it's very clear that the Syrian regime and even the Syrians in general, I mean, even before the Assad regime, since 1958, I think, Syrians in general depend a lot on the Lebanese banking sector for their savings and for their financial transactions and for their trade. So, and this continues till now, but in October 2019, when the crisis in Lebanon started, and even the Lebanese banking crisis started, this put a lot of pressure not only on the regime but also on Syrians, because they were not able anymore to withdraw their savings from Lebanese bank. And we can notice this from the sharp deterioration and devaluation of the Syrian pound that was happening in parallel with the Lebanese financial crisis. The deterioration or the devaluation in Syrian pound started in November and continues. It's continuing till now, but it started since the Lebanese banking crisis. So the link is very strong. But of course, there are endogenous factors that affect the deterioration of or the devaluation of the Syrian pound, in addition to the Lebanese banking crisis. And among these factors, of course, the deterioration in GDP and in production, the deterioration or the sharp decrease in the remittances coming from outside due to the coronavirus impact, global impact at global economy. People or Syrians outside started to lose their jobs, so they, due to the coronavirus measures or the impact, let's say, of coronavirus measures, so they cannot send a lot of money or more money to Syria. Before coronavirus crisis, Syria used to receive $5 million or approximately $5 million per day in remittances. Due to the crisis, the last estimation shows that this amount decreased to less than $2 million. All these factors affect the macroeconomic indicators or factors, but at the same time, it affects the well-being of Syrian households and the living conditions of Syrian households, because many or more than 60% of Syrian households in the regime-controlled area depend on remittances or considered remittances as one of the main household income resources. So with this deterioration, this affects directly the living conditions of Syrian people. Now back to Lebanon. Of course, the regime has a lot of shadow companies related to the regime cronies, which are functioning in Lebanon under different names. These companies used to provide the regime through the financial system or the Lebanese financial system with the goods and services that the regime needs. With the crisis in Lebanon now, this channel is not working anymore. And these shadow companies are facing major challenges in continuing their support to the regime. So, of course, it affects the regime. I mean, the financial or the banking crisis in Lebanon. But at the same time, it affects the middle and upper middle classes in Syria, because many of them use or are having their savings. They don't trust the Syrian banking sector, even before the conflict. That's why Syrian households used to have all their savings in Lebanese banks. And they used to depend also on the high interest rate paid for their savings in the Lebanese banks. Now, with the Lebanese crisis, they are not able anymore to withdraw their savings or to withdraw the interest on their savings. That's why you can see now in Damascus and in downtown Damascus, where we used to have somehow rich families, they are also suffering because even this source of income is not exist anymore. So the Lebanese banking crisis, of course, affect the regime and the Syrian people in several ways.
Thank you, Zed. I move to Basma again. Basma, what is the vision that can stop the conflict, not only war, in Syria, in light of the complexity of this conflict and its overlap with the struggle over the distribution of power in the region and the world? What are the potential mechanisms to achieve these objectives?
As you all know by now, Syria is a very complex social fabric. It is, the complexity is our richness. It is our heritage. It is something Syrians are proud of. And yet, this complexity or this very diverse social fabric has now been subjected over those years to the manipulations, first by the Assad regime, and of course this manipulation has broadened and has served the countries of the region to step in and use and rely on different communities inside the country to gain influence at the expense of a cohesive national society, if you like. My concern at this moment is if we remain without a solution, a negotiated and controlled process of transition, we are looking at a drift scenario. Yeah. The drift scenario is a very alarming one. Why? Because several communities, when they are seeing that there is basically no government out of the center in Damascus, central government is so weak and is so impotent at this moment and so negative, it only plunders resources really, but doesn't distribute. The different communities may be looking for alternative projects to protect themselves. And this has been said about the Kurdish community. They want a federation. Some of them want partition. Some of them are looking to move out and do something that is not Syrian and so on. Still to be tested. Depends who talks to them. Depends what you attach them to. Can you blame any community? I would say this is not just the Kurds today of Syria, if that is their plan. It may become the project of a Druze community in the south of Syria. Why not make it a project for the Alawi community to become suddenly to aspire to a different project? How can we blame these communities to be looking for alternative ways of organizing themselves? Libya has a history of regionalism that is very strongly present in today's Libya. Syria is not exactly the same, that doesn't follow the same pattern. Syrians built a Syrian society because they decided that they would go against sectarianism, sharing power between communities, ethnic-based communities and sect-based communities. This is our history. So in fact, we left all of that behind us and decided that this was a political society that brought all these components together because they wanted to be together against the French colonialism, against the foreign powers, and so on.
Thank you, Basma. Hussein.
But we need very strongly to rebuild the center.
Thank you, Basma. Hussein, in the light of the economic implications of the Cesar Act and the coronavirus, what is the likelihood of a shift in the vision of Syrian actors towards the conflict? What are the implications of this shift on their preferences to the outcome of the conflict? Can those actors influence the vision of key regional and international actors in this conflict?
That's a great question, and that's, I think, the biggest unknown here. I mean, obviously, how badly will the virus hit Syria is an unknown, but generally speaking, that it will be another major source of pain is known. The question of the extent to which these factors, these new additional pressures, will shift the perspectives of actors in Syria, and then can they shift the perspectives of outside actors? This is the big question. So let me say, I think on the ground in Syria, for the people, the forces that are engaged in the fighting, which are also mainly the politically powerful forces, because the forces that were politically powerful that do not have armed strength basically withered in their influence, in 2012, 2013. They were important initially, but now if you don't have essentially armed men doing something, you're kind of irrelevant. So those forces, I think, are likely to look at the increased economic pressures that Dr. Zeki has been describing really well, and the social collapse that Dr. Basma has been describing, and also the impact of the coronavirus, even if it's very severe, and say, well, that's all too bad, but it hasn't changed our strategic equation. It hasn't changed our goals. We may adapt a little bit, but not really. And they will try to charge forward, I believe, as before. Now, the question is, would it have enough of an impact socially? Would it be destabilizing enough in terms of society, in terms of the inability of the government to function, in terms of the inability of opposition groups to function, in terms of social dislocation? An outpouring, could it be, of anger that is so overwhelming at the mishandling of it that it changes, the actual political dynamics? I think those things are unlikely, but they're definitely possible. The impact on outside players is more plausible, in the sense that it changes the way in which you start to conceptualize how to transition Syria away from conflict to a political process, which is something that the external forces are interested in, and the ordinary citizens and Syrian civil society, such as it is, interested in, and all the responsible actors are interested in. But the people who are fighting on the ground mainly are and the government is not interested. It's hostile to that. So the question then becomes: is it something that the government can continue to put off? Because I think Dr. Besma has explained very well, the government is not interested in any political process. It's not interested in discussing the next phase. It doesn't want to make room for anybody else, and it doesn't have a vision beyond, obey us. That's about it. So the question then is, can the virus and the economic collapse and these other things help outside forces, whether they are friendly to the regime like Russia or unfriendly to the regime like the United States or others, help to pressure and guide the regime into a political process, even if that has to be led by the allies of Assad rather than Assad himself, as Dr. Besma was saying. I think that I don't have the answer to that question, but I tried to explain what the question is in more detail.
Thank you, Hussein. Zeki, many mentioned the humanitarian effects of the Cesar Act on the Syrian people. So how can the humanitarian effects of Cesar Act on the Syrian people be mitigated?
Good question.
Yes, actually, by law, the Cesar Act should not affect humanitarian aid to Syria. But we all know that there is the chilling effect, and all organizations are trying to de-risking or to do the over-compliance to the Cesar Act, and they prefer not to deal with anything related to Syria, not only related to Syrian government. Now, in terms of humanitarian aid, of course, there are exemptions, but even the process to get these exemptions is very costly and it's very time consuming, let's say. So even international organizations are suffering from this process to get approval to provide humanitarian aid to Syrian people. That's why I believe that international community should work more to create a kind of parallel financial structure to facilitate the process of providing humanitarian aid to Syrian people. These channels should not be related to the formal channel, because we all know that formal channel, and unfortunately, Syria state is dominated by the regime and the regime's cronies, if we can say. So we need to have this kind of parallel structure, financial channels, to facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid to Syrian people. And here I'm not talking only about food, but also health and education and other services and goods that are needed by Syrian people. Because now about 50% of Syrian population are suffering from food insecurity. And this is a huge number of people. the UN, the latest report issued by OCHA, UN OCHA, showed that 13.2 million Syrian people considered as people in need. And this is like 70% of Syrian population. So there is a huge need for humanitarian aid. And with sanctions and with Cesar Act, this humanitarian aid could be negatively affected in terms of being reached the needed people. That's why international community should consider and should think together to come up with parallel and alternative structure. I just want to add something to what Dr. Basma say about the social capital in Syria. And yes, of course, now many Syrians are or many Syrian groups, let's say, are trying to create their own identity. But we should not forget also the huge investment by different actors in identity politics. They created this identity politics for people. The regime propaganda now is still putting a lot of effort to invest in identity politics, to increase polarization between groups within Syrian society, loyalists versus opposition. This kind of polarization actually affect Syria and the Syria future, because it is decreasing the social capital at national level. And actually, we did estimate the index, social capital index, that during the first 5 years of the conflict, this index decreased by 30%. I'm talking about social capital index. And this is a huge decrease for an index like social capital. So yes, it's not only, related to people and what they want and the aspirations of people, but also people are affected by the investments in identity politics done by the fighting parties.
Thank you. Basma, whilst the Syrian opposition has failed to unify its ranks and have one clear vision and coherent leadership, the regime has failed also to represent the majority of society components either. This simply means that the root causes of the conflict in the country still exist. How can regional and global actors ensure their influence under this equation?
Thank you, Tissam. I think you're giving me an opportunity to say something that I really believe is very important and has been so far neglected. There is a political opposition in Syria. It struggles to maintain some independence. It is a very big challenge for an opposition to be independent when it is, when it has to be, resident in some country. They themselves with their families, to be independent while you have no territory on which to stand and organize yourself away from the interference of all sorts of different players, private and governmental. My belief has been over the years, I think we are hearing typically, and one example is Zaki Mahshi. We have an outstanding Syrian diaspora, which today could be working exactly on what Zaki is saying. We need to build those parallel channels, those parallel processes, because Syrians in the diaspora are probably the only ones who are willing to spend a lot of time, take risk, spend their energy, invest into identifying the very, very maybe complex channels to use. There's no easy answer to any of the problems of Syria. It needs a lot of patience. It needs a lot of investment. And that investment, I think the diaspora has it. What it needs to do is to organize itself to become a strategic partner, because a political opposition may be able to sign an agreement. Believe me, it won't be able to implement anything if the countries don't help. But the help, where we can hope for an independent Syrian agenda with the know-how, the financial resources, the networks outside. This can come from the diaspora. And I believe very, very strongly that this diaspora with the knowledge, typically Zaki is one of those dozens of young experts that we discover today in all of the think tanks of the world. And they are excellent, they're brilliant, and they are investing all of their capacities into looking for solutions for their country. So why not use these networks and build them into a real player? I believe very strongly in that. And I think we can become, as a country, a reliant on all of these brains which have left the country for over 50 years now. All of our doctors are outside. All of our good engineers are in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, across the world, United States and Europe. This is Syria. So Syria has become global to some extent. Can we make use of this asset of being global, having globalized because of a conflict today and being scattered all over, but being very motivated to help this country recover from from this disaster?
Mm.
That is my biggest hope, to be honest.
And we hope it will come to. Hussein.
Yes.
As Iran has already suffered from the consequences of the US sanctions, while the Cesar Act has started to have bearing on its ally in Syria, will this have an impact on Tehran's influence in the Syrian conflict? Will this drive Tehran to change its strategy there or push it to complicate and prolong the conflict in the country?
Yeah, I think it is at least a two-tiered process or two-phase thing. In the initial phase, if first thing about the Cesar Act is that you've had this initial tranche. It's aimed at individuals and entities in Syria, and then it can be aimed at third parties that do business. So a lot of the impact of the Cesar Act depends on how it's implemented over time. Is it implemented very aggressively by the U.S. Treasury? Is it implemented in a partial way? And that remains to be seen. So far, it's just a start. But let's say, for example, that it's implemented fairly aggressively. Let's just posit that that's the case, because I suspect it may be. Under such circumstances, the initial impact on Iran's relationship with Syria is likely to intensify the dependence of the regime and its supporters on Iran, and therefore, in a funny way, strengthen Iran's hold on not on Syria but on the regime. That would be the initial phase, because it will force the regime more and more into depending on money from its allies, even though Iran is squeezed and Russia is squeezed by the oil pricing problems and by Iran, by its own economic collapse and by the coronavirus and whatever. Still, they do have money compared to the Assad regime. They have some assets, and so the more that they could give under the table and in the form of oil and other goods that they can give, that would increase the dependence, right? In addition to which, there's all the crime, which they coordinate with, and smuggling and drugs and who knows what kind of things are sold, and in all of that. So that increases dependence, and in a funny way, it in the short term strengthens probably Iran's hand with the regime, not with the country, but with the regime. In the longer run, the hope among, I think, the administration here in Washington is that this is all part of a coordinated set of pressures on an integrated network led by Tehran that includes the Assad regime, includes Hezbollah, includes the pro-Iranian Hashd Sha'bi groups in Iraq, includes the Houthis in Yemen, includes others, right? And that all of these groups, including Iran itself and the IRGC, plus all of their regional supporters, Hezbollah and its Lebanese allies, Assad, it should all come under maximum pressure without creating a war, which would be out of control. But it's so as to force these parties and ultimately Iran itself to change its behavior, to change its policies, to come to terms, to whatever the goal may be. And I think there are different people with different ideas about what the end goal is in Washington. And so I think ultimately the hope is that it, in a bigger picture, becomes part of a pressure campaign on Iran and makes life more uncomfortable for them and ultimately forces them to, at a minimum, change their behavior.
Hussein, just there's a question came to my mind.
Sure.
Iran asked to choose between Iraq and Syria. Which one you going to choose?
If Iran is asked?
Yeah, to leave. I mean, to choose between Iraq and Syria. Which is more important?
Iraq is more important. Iraq is more important, I think, without doubt. Iraq borders Iran much more. It has a religious emphasis for Iran's religious regime that is not there in Syria. It is a much bigger constituency of potential friends in the Iraqi population itself. The cultural ties are much deeper. The relationship with Syria is based on a small clique of basically thuggish and criminal Syrians who are just doing this in their own interest. There's very little attachment, ultimately, between even the Assad regime and Iran. I mean, the affection, the fellow feeling, the feeling of commonality, whether religious or ideological, is very small. It's just a marriage of convenience. They need each other. Whereas there are parts of Iraqi society that, share a lot with Iranians, even though that they are Arabs rather than Persians and stuff, but there's a lot of overlap. And I think ultimately Iraq is much more important to Iran.
Thank you. Zaki, does the Cesar Act mean an end to Damascus and Moscow's plans to start reconstructions in Syria?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Russia has a plan to start reconstruction in Syria even before the act, Cesar Act. I think what is important for Russia is to keep its influence on gas fields, oil fields, and ports. Russia does not care about the future of Syria or Syrian people. They are not keen to have a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Syria. So it's a matter of how the Cesar Act affects their own influence and interests. And I believe that it's not so far because as I said, authoritarian regimes and their allies usually have the means to redirect the negative impact of sanctions to hit ordinary people and ordinary Syrians, I'm talking here. Because now we can see that started to fight back against Cesar Act. Yesterday, the veto by Russia and China shows that Russia insists to have or to empower the government in Damascus and to give them the control over all humanitarian aid routes to Syria. So it's not a matter of reconstruction process. And for Russia, reconstruction process will not generate enough money for them and will not generate easy money for them. It's better for Russia to control oil and gas field, what they have now already. The oil fields for United States and the gas field is controlled mainly by Russian companies, and they control the port. So it's easier for them to control only the main points, let's say, of the economy or main resorts of the economy, instead of fighting for real and inclusive and comprehensive reconstruction process. The Russians, for sure, they are not aiming to have this kind of process in Syria. They want to protect their influence, and they believe that Assad regime so far is supporting them to protect their influence. And they cannot guarantee that any other regime can provide them with this or can support them to have this influence inside Syria. So Cesar Act may affect the process of reconstruction process for Syria, but the question is, I mean, it's not a question. Russia and the Syrian regime were not even thinking of inclusive and comprehensive reconstruction process. The regime was building Marota city. Marota city is a city near Damascus, which is a modern city, and people in Syria, I mean, general public in Syria, they cannot afford even to buy 1 meter square in these buildings in Marota city. So they are building new cities. They are not reconstructing Syria. They construct new cities for elites and for the profiteers and warlords and cronies who supported the regime during the conflict. Yeah. So for sure, they don't have even a plan for reconstruction process.
Yeah. Thank you, Zaki. Before we end this wonderful session, I have a question for 3 of you. And I will start with Basma. But this is for all of you. Now, do you think that Cesar Act will achieve its goals, which is designed to have politically, internally in Syria, to weaken the Assad regime politically?
Interesting question.
Undoubtedly, it is weakening it further. But that is not going to end the conflict. This is a means to signal in a harsh way, in a way that cannot be ignored by Assad's allies, that change has to occur in Syria, that some form of democratic rule has to come to this country gradually in a controlled way. And I think this is what the message is. It is comply with the UN resolution, go for political transition, ensure that we restore security, fight terrorism in Syria, which is a source of threat to the whole region and the world. Syria has become a source of instability for the world and for the region. For it to recover, there needs to be that kind of change. This vision is shared by 95%, 99% of the international community. Also know, if they're honest, they know that this eventually has to occur. When? What kind of interest do they want to preserve for themselves? This is the discussion they need to have with the other countries. But we as Syrians understand reality, understand the constraints. We understand that Russia is an important player in Syria, but we want to recover Syrian society as a whole and build a democratic relationship between its different components. I think we all aspire to that. And if I may say, under so much strain, Syrians are finding that they are, after all, so similar, and they are living the same conditions here and there, having supported one side or the other. And maybe this is the beginning of something, at least in the minds of Syrians, the way to a reconciliation, which has never been the real problem. The real problem has been dictatorship. And so how can we open a breathing space for Syrian society to express itself? I think this is where we really have today to listen to Syrians inside and outside.
Great.
Thank you, Hussein.
Yes, I mean,
no, not inside Syria. It will weaken the Syrian regime allies, mainly Moscow and Tehran and Hezbollah.
It depends how it's implemented. It depends. It probably doesn't weaken Moscow. I don't think the Cesar Act is a threat to Russia. Maybe there are some reconstruction contracts some Russian firms were hoping to get that they won't get. It's not a big deal. I don't think it weakens Russia. The impact on Iran and Hezbollah is a really interesting question, and it depends on whether the Cesar Act is integrated into a coordinated long-term strategy aimed at pressure on this entire bloc in the Middle East. And the elements of that are there. But there are parts of US policy that push in the other direction. In other words, if you gave, say, Iran the choice between saying, well, you have a large American military presence staying and no Cesar Act, versus you have Cesar Act with American forces leaving in 2 years, they would take the second one. So it depends a little bit on the overall context. I think you can say it at the moment, it does contribute to pressure on Iran, for sure. It also maybe makes the regime more dependent on the Iranians and everybody else who will help them, because it makes them weaker. It does put more pressure on Lebanon. It puts more pressure on Hezbollah. It puts more pressure in the long run on Iran and the IRGC. So yes, it does. Whether it will be effective, it depends on it being part of a really integrated strategy with a clear goal that is sustained over the years that will be required to get there. And that's, I don't have a crystal ball. Yeah.
Thank you. Zeki, will it weaken the regime economically?
Yes, for sure. I mean, sanctions in general, and mainly now Cesar Act, because Cesar Act is targeting mainly not the regime, but anyone deals with the regime. So for sure, it will weaken the regime economic resources. But at the same time, and as Dr. Hussein mentioned, that the act should be a part or a tool in a comprehensive strategy, clear strategy on how to weaken the regime and on how to dismantle the foundation of the authoritarian regime in Syria and build, as Dr. Basma said, a democratic state. Maybe the Cesar Act objectives are not in line with what the majority of Syrian people are looking for. That's why it's our duty as Syrians, in support of the international community, to come up with our own alternatives and try to use or to convince international community to use these tools, I'm talking about sanctions and Cesar Act, as a part of this strategy to serve the interest of Syrian people and the international community, and not only the interest of United States or external actors. The most important thing is to serve the interest of Syrian people, to come up with something sustainable, to come up with something that really could dismantle the economic and the institutional foundation of the authoritarian regime in Syria.
Well said.
Thank you.
Basma, Hussein, Zeki, thank you very much. It was a superb discussion. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I thank me and the attendees and the viewers really got interested. This a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. Hope see you not virtually in Abu Dhabi next year, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.